Hey everyone, I hope all is well. In this video, I'm going to discuss the parable of the marriage feast in Matthew 22. And for whoever is watching, this parable, if you're honest with the text, if you take it in context in the book of Matthew, in context with the prophets, it is undeniable, irrefutable evidence that the final day of judgment did not occur in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. The full preterist doctrine relies as one of its most foundational pillars time statements in the New Testament. And so the interpretations are driven on time statements. Not in this video, but in another, I will address time statements. I will get into it actually very shortly at the end of this video. But if we are to take the words of Jesus seriously and look at the context, then there is not one single possible way to understand this parable in the context of Matthew and believe that a judgment, the final judgment, happened in 70 AD. And with that, I'm going to get right into it. So I'm going to read the parable. Verse 1. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again he sent out other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" So we have several things that happen. And here's the order of events as established in this parable. Number one, the king is giving a marriage feast for his son, and the first thing that happens is there is an invitation to the feast. He tells his servants, everything is ready. Tell those who are invited to come. Second thing that happens, when those servants go and tell them the wedding feast is ready, they refuse to come, and they mistreat those servants and kill some of them. Third thing that happens, the king is enraged at this. He sends his troops and destroys their city. He burns it. After this, the king tells his servants to go invite others as many as you find, both good and bad. Gather evil and good, as many as you'll find that will accept the invitation. Tell them to come. The last thing that happens is that the wedding hall is filled with guests. When this wedding hall becomes full, the king comes in and sees someone without the proper garment, and he's thrown out into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He is thrown out of the kingdom. The very first thing that we notice when we identify who these players are and what exactly is going on, we understand in the context of where Jesus is giving these parables, he's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's talking about them. So these are the players that do not accept the invitation, or who were invited and accepted the invitation, and then when it's ready, they don't want to come. They are the ones who mistreated his servants being the prophets and Jesus and the apostles. The king is enraged and he destroys their city. This is the destruction of Jerusalem that was prophesied by Jesus. If we go to verse 8 and 9. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways and invite as many as you find there. Invite to the wedding feast. Notice now that the wedding feast does not happen yet. At the destruction of this city, the wedding feast doesn't commence. There has to be gathered another group of people. And we know that to be the gospel going to the Gentiles. And the king comes in and he sees someone there who doesn't have the proper wedding garment. Now I'm going to read something from a book called The Parables, Jewish Tradition and Christian Interpretation by Brad H. Young, page 174 and 175. I'll just read a couple things. He says, Matthew speaks from a pastoral concern for his community when he emphasizes the problem of the wedding garment at the end of the illustration. The good and the bad are among those gathered in the community of faith, and there will most certainly be a division. The theme of the tares among the wheat as well as the bad fish among the good appears here, where anticipation rises concerning the judgment scene. And on down he says, according to Matthew, not all who are participating in the life of the community will be accepted in the final judgment. Many are called, but few are chosen. Now this is a theme in Matthew, because if you go to the Sermon on the Mount, you see Jesus says in Matthew 5:22, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, those who do the will of my Father. Now, there's this marriage feast scene in the book of Revelation. In chapter 19, verse 8, it says, this garment, this clothing, it was given to them, fine linen. It is the righteous deeds of the saints. So not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, but only those who do the will of my Father. The righteous deeds of the saints, to the one who hears his words and does them. This theme pops up again in Matthew, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the main point being right this minute is that the wedding feast that happens in Revelation 19 does not happen at the fall and destruction of that city. Before this banquet happens, there's a gathering of good and bad. Brad Young mentioned the parable of the net and the parable of the tares and the wheat. My last video, I showed how the end of the age, there's a separation. In the field is the world. The end of the age is the separation. If we go to the parable of the dragnet, in verse 47 of chapter 13. And I'll read this too. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast to the sea and gathering fish of every kind." Not just Jewish fish, in other words. "And when it was filled," just like when the wedding hall was full of guests, when it was filled, "they drew it up on the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad fish they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age." So, okay, it's pretty simple here right now, and pretty obvious and pretty clear if you're looking at the context, that this end of the age did not happen in 70 AD. The end of the age happened after the good and bad were gathered, either into the net or into the wedding hall. "The angels will come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Again, here's the same language. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The wedding hall is full of guests. The net is full of fish. The wedding hall is filled with guests sometime after the destruction of the city. It's pretty obvious, but it gets even more, I can't say it gets more obvious. It gets just solidified further when you keep reading in Matthew. Because Jesus gives the Olivet Discourse, and he, in the Gospel of Matthew, spends much more a deal of time on talking about his return. In verse 42, he says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time the night the thief was coming, he would have been on alert, would not have allowed his house to be broken into." Okay. He goes on to say, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, in whom his master put in charge of his household to give them the food at the proper time? Blessed is a slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes." So here's a faithful slave that's contrasted with an evil slave that says in his heart, "My master is not coming for a long time," and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat his drink with drunkards. Now, both of them called him master. In the parable of the marriage feast, both accept the invitation. One doesn't have the wedding garments. The faithful slave has been obedient, has done what his master's asked him to do. The evil slave has not. This theme reoccurs in Matthew, and it continues on from here. But what does he say on this parable about his return? There's this separation between the faithful and the evil slaves. And in verse 51 says, "And will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." We see the same language of separation, where the evil are taken out from among the good. There's weeping and gnashing of teeth. They're cast into outer darkness or the fiery furnace. And that's not the end. He continues. He gives the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 are wise and 5 are foolish. Here again, it's the same theme. And this is after Jesus had talked about the gospel going to all the nations. And then the end will come. So what happens? Pretty sure you guys are familiar with this one. I'm looking for certain verses here. There's 5 wise, 5 foolish. The bridegroom comes, 5 go in and 5 don't. 5 go into the kingdom, and 5 don't. They're left outside of the kingdom. And then he continues with the parable of the talents, and check this out. Let me read some of these verses. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. All right, they deal with the talents. Okay. Verse 19. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. What happened to the one who did not do anything with what he received? Verse 30. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's the same language. I want to reinforce right here again that when the king says bind him, throw him, outer darkness, fiery furnace, weeping and gnashing of teeth, at this judgment scene happens well after 70 AD, because the marriage feast does not happen when the city is set on fire. It has happened after the invitation goes to everyone. The gospel must continue to go out to all the nations. So, Matthew all leads up to this, where he comes to the actual judgment scene. He's giving these parables. Jesus is giving these parables leading up to this judgment scene. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Verse 32, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate from them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Notice, back in Matthew 22, the separation happens when the king comes in to inspect who has the right garments on. Revelation 19, it's the righteous deeds of the saints. What's the separation in Matthew 25? You fed me when I was hungry, you get to enter. You guys did not feed, you don't get to enter. The righteous go into eternal life, the wicked into eternal punishment. The separation happens at the end of the age. And if we're interpreting Matthew in context, the end of the age doesn't happen in 70 AD. It can't. This is according to Jesus' own parable. This is important to take Jesus in context. Now what I want to do, because what usually happens is the context is just either ignored or butchered when it comes to full preterist interpretations, because they think that the time phrases must tell them how to interpret, and that is exactly the opposite. I plan on doing a more in-depth video on the time statements, but what I want to do is go back to the prophets, specifically Zephaniah, and I want to read something and see if you catch this language that Zephaniah uses. Now, Zephaniah was written approximately 630 BC, somewhere around there. He prophesied during the reign of Josiah, which was from 640 to 609 BC. Now listen to what Zephaniah says, and it is about the day of the Lord. This is what Zephaniah writes about. Chapter 1, verse 2, I will completely remove all things from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I'm not going to read all of it, so I'll skip down to verse 7. Pay attention here. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated his guests. Then it will come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. Now, it sounds a lot like Matthew 22, where there's these consecrated guests. There's a feast. The fattened ox was butchered. And the ones that didn't have the proper garment was bound and cast outside. But Zephaniah says the day of the Lord is near. He says it's near. In Matthew 22, this day of the Lord happens after 70 AD. 700 years away, 70 AD is. And what else does Zephaniah say about the day of the Lord? Let's keep reading. Verse 14. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very quickly. Listen, the day of the Lord. In it, the warrior cries out bitterly. He keeps on going. Let's see. Day of wrath, day of trouble, day of darkness, day of clouds. Verse 18. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to deliver them on the day of the Lord's wrath, and all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy, for he will make a complete end, indeed a terrifying one, of all the inhabitants of the earth. Let's go into chapter 2. There are no chapter divisions. Gather yourselves together, yes, gather, O nation without shame. Before the decree takes effect, the day passes like the chaff, before the burning anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth who have carried out his ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek humility, perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. Now, Zephaniah, if you continue to read, is talking about the judgment on nations, like in Matthew 25. Let's go to chapter 3. I'll skip down to verse 6. I have cut off nations. Their corner towers are in ruins. I have made their streets desolate, with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste, without a man, without an inhabitant. Therefore wait for me, this is verse 8, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. So there's a judgment on nations, much like in Matthew 25. There's a separation. And Zephaniah says it's near and it's coming very quickly. And Zephaniah is writing 700 years before the fall of Jerusalem. And Matthew tells us, in context, indisputably, that this separation doesn't occur when that city is burned with fire. There have to be others gathered to the feast. You have to, if you are a full preterist, you have to seriously ask yourself if you could continue to warp the context because of time text when I've just shown you, and I will show you again in another video many examples of time text where soon and near hundreds or more years off. You have to rightly divide the word of truth. You have to read in context. And silly little schemes where someone says near and it doesn't work. And that's why I'm not a full preterist, nor I ever will be a full preterist, nor will I ever be convinced of full preterism, because you have to ignore the context of Jesus' words and the apostles' words. And then the very foundational pillar of that doctrine doesn't stand when you go back to the Old Testament. It doesn't stand. It doesn't even have a chance of standing. I implore you to go back to the scripture and study it and test what you've been taught before you make videos trying to convince other people of a denial of the return of Jesus Christ to this earth to restore what God made and called very good. God bless.